All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. We are going to completely reframe how we think about the concept of seduction. We're stripping away the modern idea of it just being some sleazy pursuit, and instead, we're going to look at it as a masterful, historical form of psychological power. So, if you've ever wanted to understand exactly how some of history's most famous figures bent the world to their will, you are definitely in the right place.
We're pulling this directly from Robert Greene's fascinating and honestly pretty controversial book, The Art of Seduction. We'll be looking at this entire topic analytically. We're going to examine how history's absolute greatest figures, everyone from ancient queens to modern politicians, used seduction not just for romance, but as the ultimate weapon of persuasion and control.
Here is our roadmap for today. Number 1. The ultimate form of power. 2. The seducer's mindset. 3. The Siren archetype. 4. The Rake archetype. And finally, number 5. Discovering your character. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The ultimate form of power. Moving from physical force to psychological surrender. So, think back thousands of years. Power was essentially maintained with brute strength and physical violence, right? And that was almost exclusively a masculine domain. Women really had no way to compete on that physical battlefield. But as the source text reveals, some highly creative women invented a completely new way to turn this dynamic on its head. And this brilliantly illustrates how early seductresses like Cleopatra basically substituted physical strength for the much more powerful act of psychological surrender. They realized that if men controlled the world through force, women could control those same men through pleasure. They used alluring appearances, indirect cunning to just bypass the battlefield entirely. It's a total game changer.
And as you'll see, this whole concept evolved dramatically over time. It started way back in antiquity with these brilliant ancient queens. But by the 17th century, men like the legendary Don Juan started adopting these historically feminine methods. They started using dazzling appearances and soft words to overcome resistance. And then it scaled up massively in the 19th century. Politicians like Napoleon realized they could actually use seductive oratory, theatricality, and raw charisma to seduce the masses. They were gaining immense power without firing a single shot. Wild, right?
Moving right along to Section 2. The seducer's mindset. Adopting a warrior's outlook on life.
Here's the really crucial point to grasp. A master seducer treats literally every interaction like a strategic game of theater. They aren't weighed down by this modern need to just be themselves. No, they're incredibly fluid. Plus, their approach is completely amoral. They just don't deal in moral judgments because, frankly, judging people is fundamentally anti-seductive. Instead, their focus is entirely outward. They want to get under a target's skin, figure out their deep-rooted, secret desires, and then become masterful providers of overwhelming pleasure. They offer a release that the target just cannot resist.
Section 3. The Siren archetype. The ultimate male fantasy figure.
So, let's talk about the Siren. She operates on a man's absolute most basic emotions. You see, men are often secretly exhausted by the constant societal pressure to always be in control. The Siren embodies this mythic, highly charged physical presence that makes a man actually want to let go of that control. But here's the kicker. She also brings a hint of danger, which turns out to be surprisingly seductive. The sheer danger of losing oneself, or maybe even ruining one's reputation, makes chasing her incredibly thrilling.
You can kind of think of the Siren as a beautiful mirage. She uses the promise of pure pleasure to compel very powerful men to chase her vehemently. And she stands out from everyone else by projecting an image of supreme, untouchable confidence that most people simply don't possess.
And honestly, no one in history embodied this better than Cleopatra. Picture this. It's 48 BC, and she's an exiled queen. To get an audience with Julius Caesar, she actually has herself smuggled into the harbor wrapped up inside a carpet. When it's unfurled, she literally rises up, half-clothed like Venus emerging from the ocean. This perfectly captures a myth-busting truth from our source material. Cleopatra did not rely on conventional beauty. There were plenty of prettier women in Alexandria. What she relied on was incredible theatricality to absolutely dazzle Caesar.
There's this amazing quote from the Roman writer Dio Cassius. He noted that it was her lilting voice and constantly shifting, larger-than-life persona that drew men in. That's what kept tough, battle-hardened leaders like Caesar and later Mark Antony completely spellbound. She gave them constant variety. We're talking mock battles, decadent parties, lavish spectacles. She never let them get bored for a second. And, crucially, she never let them feel completely secure.
Now let's fast forward to the 20th century with Marilyn Monroe.
born Norma Jean. She actually discovered the sheer power of the sex siren archetype entirely by accident. At just 13 years old, living in an orphanage, she borrowed a sweater that was a few sizes too small. Instantly, all the boys gathered around her. She noted that they stared at her as if it were a gold mine. Right then and there, she realized that a highly charged physical presence, especially when combined with her natural, childlike innocence, could absolutely floor men without her having to lift a finger.
So both Monroe and Cleopatra built this up using 3 specific physical tools to cast their spells. First up is the voice. It has to be calm, low, and unhurried. Marilyn famously trained her voice to be deep and breathy. Second is body and adornment. They used clothes to dazzle, but relied heavily on selective disclosure, revealing just enough to stir the imagination. And third, movement, floating gracefully, projecting this air of total, languorous ambiguity.
All right, Section 4, the Rake archetype, the great female fantasy figure.
Now we're flipping the script. The Rake's appeal is all about danger and a total lack of restraint. Women often feel underappreciated by cautious, normal men who get easily distracted. But the Rake? He is a slave to his passion. When he desires a woman, he will momentarily go to the absolute ends of the earth for her. Yes, he's totally disloyal and amoral, but that intoxicating, burning, intense focus is exactly what makes his attention so addictive.
There's this perfect historical story from the text about the young Fronsac, the future Duc de Richelieu. Back in 1710, at just 15 years old, he arrives at the incredibly stiff, gloomy, and super-religious court of the aging King Louis XIV. And Fronsac just injects this massive dose of thrilling novelty into the place. He was impudent, his eyes practically bored into you, and his hands were dangerously quick.
His impudent and witty nature was just this massive breath of fresh air. He was so incredibly bold. I mean, when his wandering hands went a little too far up a duchess's skirt, the king threw him straight into the Bastille prison to teach him a lesson. But get this, the ladies of the court couldn't endure his absence. They actually pleaded for his release. Because compared to all the stiffs in court, his unapologetic danger was just too much fun to lose. When you look at the Rake's toolkit, it is heavily reliant on psychology. He offers this unrestrained adoration. His desire is so strong it literally becomes contagious. And crucially, because words are a universal weakness, the Rake heavily leverages seductive, poetic language. He says exactly what the target desperately wants to hear. Couple that with a notorious reputation of past conquests, which proves he's highly desired by others, and he completely overwhelms a target's rationality.
Bringing it all home with Section 5, discovering your character, developing your latent qualities.
So, why does all this history and psychology matter to us right now? Well, as the text reveals, we all have this power of attraction. Successful seduction doesn't start with some cheesy, obvious, manipulative maneuver. It starts with your character. It's not about being born with some mystical trait or having flawless physical beauty. It's simply about identifying and amplifying the latent qualities that already exist deep within you.
The rule here is actually pretty simple. There is absolutely no point in being timid. We'll excuse the excesses of an unabashed rake, for instance, but a half-hearted rake, they get zero respect. Whether you have the theatrality of a siren, the bold language of a rake, or the spontaneity of a natural, the key is to embrace that specific trait fully and confidently. You've got to turn up the volume on what makes you unique.
And that wraps up our explainer for today. But before you go, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Which of these immense historical forces of psychological power is already hiding inside of you, just waiting to be mastered? Take a real look inward, find that dormant trait, and step into it. Thanks so much for learning with me today.